There is a moment in every relationship that feels like the end, but most people misunderstand which moment that truly is. They think it's the fight that finally explodes, the accusation that cuts too deep, or the betrayal that can no longer be ignored. But those moments, as painful as they are, still contain something fragile and dangerous: hope. The real ending doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives quietly. It arrives when an empath stops caring. This is the moment that terrifies people, even if they don't know how to name it. Because when an empath is still arguing, still explaining, still trying to be understood, there is still a thread connecting them to the relationship. That thread may be thin, frayed, and stretched to the breaking point, but it exists. The moment caring disappears, that thread doesn't weaken. It vanishes. And once it's gone, nothing can be tied back together again. Carl Jung warned that the human psyche does not break the way we imagine it does. It doesn't always shatter loudly under pressure. More often, it adapts, it transforms. Jung observed that when a person suppresses a fundamental part of themselves for too long, the psyche compensates in ways that feel sudden and irreversible. This is especially true for empaths, who are conditioned early in life to believe that love means endurance and loyalty means self-erasure. An empath doesn't stop caring because they are cruel. They stop caring because they have reached a psychological threshold. For years, they have absorbed emotions that were never theirs to carry. They have anticipated needs that were never acknowledged. They have explained themselves in rooms where no one was listening. And each time they did, they told their psyche a dangerous lie, that their worth depended on how much they could tolerate. Jung understood that no psyche can survive indefinitely under that kind of imbalance. He described a principle called psychological compensation, the idea that when one trait is overdeveloped, its opposite begins to form in the unconscious. Excessive selflessness does not lead to sainthood. It leads to collapse, followed by reversal. This reversal is what Jung called enantiodromia, the moment when a person flips into their psychological opposite. For the empath, this flip is not gradual. It doesn't come with warnings. One day they are still trying, still hoping, still convincing themselves that if they just explain it better or love harder, something will change. And then, often triggered by something that seems small to outsiders, the caring simply shuts off. Not partially, completely. This is the moment people misinterpret as coldness. They say the empath has changed. They accuse them of becoming distant, heartless, or selfish. But Jung would say this isn't a loss of empathy, it's the restoration of balance. What has disappeared is not compassion, but self-betrayal. Empaths live in a constant state of emotional labor. They read between the lines. They sense shifts in tone before words are spoken. They notice discomfort others ignore. Over time, they begin to believe that managing emotional reality is their responsibility. They become the stabilizing force in chaotic systems, the unspoken glue holding relationships together. And because this labor is invisible, it is rarely reciprocated. Jung warned that when a person's energy is continually drained without renewal, the psyche intervenes, not gently, but decisively. The empath's unconscious begins to construct boundaries where none existed before. These boundaries do not announce themselves, they do not negotiate, they appear as indifference. This indifference is not numbness, it is clarity. It is the mind finally seeing without distortion. The empath stops filtering reality through hope. They stop editing other people's behavior to make it more palatable. They stop explaining away disrespect as misunderstanding or cruelty as pain. For the first time, they see the relationship exactly as it is, not as it could be. Carl Jung believed that this moment of clarity is one of the most powerful psychological shifts a person can experience. He described it as the integration of the shadow, the parts of the self that were previously rejected in order to maintain a certain identity. For empaths, the shadow often contains assertiveness, detachment, and the willingness to walk away without explanation. This is why the moment an empath stops caring feels so final. They are no longer negotiating with their own conscience. They are no longer torn between loyalty to others and loyalty to themselves. The inner conflict that once kept them engaged disappears. And without that conflict, there is nothing left to fuel the relationship. What makes this moment so unsettling for others is that it comes without drama. There is no rage to argue with, no tears to manipulate, no emotional reaction to hook into. The empath doesn't lash out. They don't seek revenge. They simply withdraw their presence. And presence, as Jung understood, is the true source of power in any relationship. People often mistake this withdrawal as apathy, but Jung drew a sharp distinction between apathy and psychological sovereignty. Apathy is exhaustion without insight. Sovereignty is withdrawal with awareness. When an empath reaches this state, they are not running away. They are reclaiming themselves. This is also the moment when unhealthy dynamics collapse. Manipulative individuals rely on emotional responsiveness. They depend on guilt, hope, obligation, and empathy to maintain control. As long as the empath cares, the system functions. But when caring disappears, the system fails. Words lose their impact. Apologies feel hollow. Promises sound repetitive. The empath is no longer emotionally available to be pulled back in. Jung warned that this kind of awakening often feels shocking even to the person experiencing it. Empaths frequently describe it as a switch flipping, a sudden internal silence where emotional noise once dominated. They don't feel triumphant, they feel calm, and that calm is what signals that the change is permanent. This is not the end of empathy. It is the end of self-sacrifice masquerading as love. The empath has not become less human. They have become whole. They have finally stopped confusing suffering with virtue and endurance with strength. And once this shift occurs, there is no going back to who they were before, not because they are hardened, but because they are no longer willing to abandon themselves to keep others comfortable. Carl Jung believed that this moment marks the beginning of true individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you were conditioned to be. Most people will never understand this transformation. They will remember the empath as they were when they were still giving, still accommodating, still trying. They will grieve the loss of access, not the loss of connection. But the empath knows the truth. Caring was never infinite. It was sacred. And once it was depleted, something far more valuable took its place. When an empath stops caring, the world around them often scrambles to make sense of what just happened. People search for explanations that allow them to avoid the truth. They assume the empath must be angry, bitter, or emotionally damaged. But Carl Jung would say this reaction reveals more about the observer than the empath. Because what truly unsettles people is not emotional distance, but emotional independence. For a long time, the empath's caring functioned as emotional gravity. It kept conversations orbiting. It kept conflicts unresolved but alive. It kept broken dynamics moving forward despite their dysfunction. When that gravity disappears, everything drifts apart. And the ones who benefited most from the empath's emotional labor feel it first. Jung warned that humans are deeply uncomfortable with losing psychological leverage. When someone no longer reacts, no longer explains, no longer seeks understanding, the familiar power balance collapses. The empath is no longer predictable, and unpredictability, especially when it comes with calm, is perceived as threat. This is why people often escalate when an empath stops caring. They become louder, more dramatic, more apologetic, or more aggressive. They accuse the empath of changing, of being cold, of abandoning them. But Jung would point out that what they are really reacting to is the loss of control. The empath is no longer participating in the emotional contract that once defined the relationship. For the empath, this shift feels strangely quiet. There is no sense of victory. There is relief. The internal tension that once dominated their inner world dissolves. They no longer rehearse conversations in their head. They no longer anticipate emotional fallout. They no longer brace themselves before speaking. The constant background anxiety disappears, replaced by a steady sense of inner alignment. Jung believed that this calm is a sign of psychological integration. The empath has stopped rejecting parts of themselves in order to preserve connection. They are no longer splitting themselves into the one who feels and the one who endures. They have reclaimed their right to self-protection without self-loathing. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this transformation is that it does not erase compassion. The empath still understands pain. They still recognize suffering, but they are no longer compelled to rescue. Jung would describe this as the difference between empathy and identification. Empathy allows understanding without absorption. Identification consumes the self in the emotions of others. When the empath stops caring, they stop identifying, and in doing so, they finally preserve their own psyche. This is why attempts to reignite the old dynamic fail. Guilt no longer works because the empath no longer believes they are responsible for other people's emotions. Hope no longer works because they are no longer invested in potential. Fear no longer works because they have already faced the worst outcome, walking away. What remains is clarity, and clarity is immune to manipulation. Jung warned that clarity often looks like indifference to those who are accustomed to chaos. But indifference born from awareness is not emotional absence. It is emotional mastery. The empath is no longer ruled by unconscious patterns. They are choosing where their energy goes, and more importantly, where it does not. This is the point where many relationships reach their true ending, even if they technically continue. Conversations become shorter, explanations stop, emotional availability decreases. The empath does not announce their withdrawal. They simply stop volunteering their inner world. And without access to that inner world, the relationship loses its depth. What makes this moment irreversible is that the empath has crossed an internal line. Jung emphasized that once a person becomes conscious of a psychological truth, they cannot return to unconsciousness. The empath has seen the cost of caring without boundaries. They have recognized the pattern, and once a pattern is seen clearly, it loses its power. This awareness also changes how the empath views their past. They stop romanticizing endurance. They stop praising themselves for surviving situations that required self-abandonment. Instead, they feel a quiet grief for the version of themselves who believed that love had to hurt to be real. Jung would say, this grief is necessary. It marks the death of a false identity. The false identity was built around being needed, being useful, being the emotional anchor. It was rewarded with moments of appreciation and long stretches of neglect. When that identity dissolves, there is a temporary emptiness. But it is not despair, it is space. Space where the empath can finally exist without performing. In this space, something subtle but profound happens. The empath's attention turns inward. Not in a narcissistic way, but in a self-preserving one. They begin to notice how they feel instead of how others feel about them. They begin to make decisions based on alignment rather than approval. Jung believed this inward turn was essential for individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self. This is also when the empath's presence changes. They no longer radiate urgency. They no longer signal availability. There is a steadiness to them that feels unfamiliar to those who once relied on their emotional responsiveness. Conversations with them feel different, shorter, clearer, more grounded. They are not withholding affection as punishment. They are simply no longer overextending. People who are psychologically healthy often respect this shift. They adapt, they adjust, they meet the empath at their new level of self-respect. But people who relied on imbalance cannot. They experience the empath's boundaries as rejection, even though boundaries are not rejection. They are definition. Jung warned that when boundaries emerge, they reveal who was benefiting from their absence. The empath does not need to accuse or explain. The dynamic speaks for itself. Relationships that were built on mutual respect stabilize. Relationships built on extraction fall apart. And through all of this, the empath remains surprisingly calm. There is no urge to convince anyone of their growth, no desire to prove that they are right. The need for validation has dissolved. They trust their internal experience more than external reactions. This trust is the foundation of psychological sovereignty. The most unsettling part for others is that the empath does not seek closure. They do not demand understanding. They accept that some people will never see them clearly, and they no longer need them to. Jung would say this acceptance marks the completion of a cycle. The empath has learned the lesson, and once a lesson is learned, the psyche moves on. This is why the moment an empath stops caring cannot be undone. It is not a phase. It is a recalibration, a return to center, a quiet decision to no longer participate in dynamics that require self-erasure. And from this point forward, the empath's energy becomes selective, intentional, and rare. Carl Jung believed that the most powerful position a person can occupy is not dominance, control, or even confidence. It is inner completion. When an empath stops caring, they are not retreating into emptiness. They are stepping into completion. And this is what makes the change so unsettling to those around them. The empath no longer needs the relationship to define them, sustain them, or justify them. For years, the empath's sense of self was entangled with being understanding, forgiving, and endlessly patient. Their identity was reinforced by how much they could carry without complaint. Jung warned that this kind of identity is fragile because it depends on external validation. The moment appreciation fades or exploitation begins, the psyche is placed under strain. Eventually, it demands correction. That correction is what people witness as emotional withdrawal. But from the inside, it feels like alignment. The empath no longer feels split between what they feel and what they tolerate. There is no longer an internal argument about whether they are being too sensitive or too demanding. The noise stops, and in that silence a deeper sense of self emerges. This is why the empath does not announce their departure. There is nothing to negotiate. The decision was not made impulsively. It was made slowly, over years of unmet needs and unacknowledged sacrifices, and then executed in a single moment of clarity. Jung would say that when the unconscious finishes its work, the conscious mind follows without hesitation. Those who attempt to pull the empath back often rely on familiar tactics. They promise change. They appeal to shared history. They evoke guilt. They remind the empath of who they used to be. But the empath no longer identifies with that version of themselves. They see it as a role they outgrew, not a loss they need to mourn. What remains is a quiet dignity. The empath no longer explains their boundaries because they no longer doubt them. They no longer argue their reality because they trust their perception. Jung emphasized that psychological maturity is marked by this internal trust. The individual no longer needs consensus to feel grounded. This maturity is often misread as detachment, but it is not emotional distance from life. It is emotional proximity to truth. The empath is no longer numbing themselves to survive. They are fully present, but selectively so. Their energy is no longer scattered across people who cannot meet them with reciprocity. One of the most profound shifts that occurs at this stage is the empath's relationship with loneliness. Previously, separation felt unbearable because connection was tied to identity. Now, solitude feels peaceful. It is not a punishment, it is a refuge. Jung believed that solitude is essential for individuation because it allows the psyche to recalibrate without external interference. In this solitude, the empath reconnects with parts of themselves that were neglected. Their intuition sharpens, their body relaxes, their thoughts slow down. They are no longer scanning for emotional cues or preparing to manage other people's reactions. The constant vigilance fades. What replaces it is a grounded sense of self that does not fluctuate based on external approval. This is why attempts to provoke an emotional response fail. The empath is not suppressing emotion. There is simply nothing to react to. The situation has already been understood. The conclusion has already been reached. Jung warned that once understanding replaces hope, emotional attachment dissolves naturally. At this stage, the empath's silence becomes their boundary. They do not weaponize it. They do not use it to punish. They simply no longer fill space that does not honor them. Conversations become factual. Interactions become brief. There is no hostility, only absence. And absence, when it is chosen consciously, is a form of power. This power is not aggressive. It does not seek dominance. It does not need recognition. It exists quietly, rooted in self-respect. Jung described this as psychological sovereignty, the state in which a person governs their inner world without outsourcing authority to others. People who encounter the empath after this transformation often sense something different. There is less urgency, less explanation, less emotional labor. The empath listens but does not absorb. They care but do not attach. They engage but do not overextend. This balance is what makes them feel both calm and unshakable. For those who once relied on the empath's availability, this change can feel like rejection. But rejection implies intention. The empath is not rejecting others. They are choosing themselves. Jung believed that this choice is the foundation of mental health. Without it, compassion becomes self-destruction. This is the warning Jung left behind, often misunderstood and rarely applied. Caring without boundaries is not virtue. It is avoidance of self-confrontation. And when an empath finally confronts themselves, when they stop abandoning their own needs to preserve connection, the transformation is irreversible. They do not become cruel. They become unavailable to exploitation. They do not seek revenge. They disengage. They do not demand understanding. They accept that some people only valued the version of them that was easy to access. This acceptance is liberating. The empath no longer wastes energy trying to be seen by those who benefited from their invisibility. They redirect that energy inward toward alignment, peace, and wholeness. Jung would say this is the final stage of the cycle where the individual returns to themselves with awareness. And this is why the moment an empath stops caring is not a tragedy. It is a return to truth, a return to self, a return to a life that no longer requires suffering as proof of love. The world may remember the empath as they were when they were still giving, still accommodating, still trying, but the empath remembers something else entirely. They remember the moment they chose themselves. And that moment becomes the foundation of everything that follows. Because once an empath understands that caring was never their weakness but their gift, they also understand something equally important. A gift given endlessly without respect is no longer a gift. It is a sacrifice. And when that sacrifice ends, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is a person who knows their worth, honors their limits, and no longer needs to disappear inside someone else to feel whole. That is Carl Jung's warning, and it is also his promise.